So what is today's session? This is something I've wanted to do for quite a long time. It was one of those things where the idea was one thing, but the reality kind of turned out a bit differently. So I would call this Paul's taxonomy, which is a play on the word of taxonomy, of course. If you needed the joke explained, the reason I call it Paul's taxonomy is because this is a pretty chaotic and in no particular order detailed list of teaching strategies, basically, of vocational teaching strategies. It was a bit like that bit of artwork there on the side where I just kind of threw all the ideas, I chatted to my colleagues, I've got a lot of researchers. I'll introduce you to some really great and recent research from NCVER at the end of the session. Based on years and years of experience, when you do what I do, Accellier is a TAE provider, so we spend a lot of time seeing what works, not just teaching the strategies, but also going into different providers and seeing how trainers teach. It's been particularly wonderful with this new TAE. There's a practicum unit, and in the practicum unit, the students who do that one are required to create a journal of their experiences. And one of those things is we get them to experiment with new techniques. So seeing how that plays out for people as well has been really, really helpful. So, there is a temptation to want to create a taxonomy, to create a classification system or to organize all these things into subheadings and categories. But it's so hard because you'll end up with certain things that fit in multiple places, and it just all gets a bit messy. And I think I suppose that at the end of the day, teaching is a bit like that. As trainers, we pick and choose the tools that work, and sometimes what works for one student group may not actually work for another, or for a delivery mode, or we might rely on certain numbers of students for certain activities to work. So we do need to be a little dynamic. So I found it very challenging to organize it into any particular order. So there's no order. And you'll also notice that some of the things that I share with you today are kind of overarching approaches. So we might say coaching is one of the techniques. Well, if you really break down coaching, well, a coach might also do some demonstrating or some explicit instruction, or they might use feedback, so they use, I guess, sub techniques underneath that as part of the broad thing of coaching. So I've got some broad overarching approaches, but also then specific activities like role play. And then, of course, you can break down role play further. And then specific tools and techniques like the Ask It basket. So they're highly specific. And I've given no preference or really order or anything to them. I've just kind of put these really common strategies out there. Now, as I warned the people in the summary, the overview of the session where you sign up, it is aimed at beginners. And we got a lot of questions, a lot of requests from people who are starting out, or from maybe managers in RTOs who sort of want to have a bit of a resource for their newer trainers who are just joining. What tools are in my toolkit for my trainers? What things can they pick and choose from and select from to use to create more engaging learning experiences for their students? These things are rarely used in isolation. So, we would not just use one of these techniques alone. We would typically connect or chain them up. So, for instance, we might do an instructional session or even a sort of mini lecture. We might then follow that with a demonstration or interleave a demonstration into it. We might then do some guided practice. We might give students feedback, and then we might step back and allow independent practice. So these things can chain together. So they're not meant to be used in isolation, but I do explore them as a separate entity. I'll be honest with you, I've prioritized quantity over depth today. So I'm probably breaking every rule in the book in that I'm unashamedly just going to do, I suppose, information overload today. I'm I wanted to cover as many techniques as an entry point rather than go into each individual one. And, it's nice to, I've got other sessions that we do where we dive into specific examples and we have case studies and stories that bring them to life. But for this particular one, I really just wanted to provide an entry point for all these strategies. And then you know what you're doing. You've got ChatGPT and AI, and you've got all sorts of tools. You can Google stuff, and you can actually dive deeper into any of these techniques if you want to, see examples and bring them to life. And I always encourage, especially with our team, like I love experimentation, thoughtful experimentation, mindful experimentation, where you maybe try a new technique and actively reflect on that. It's a comprehensive list today, but it's not exhaustive. So you might go through and you'll sort of get to the end of it and go, oh, gee, what about, you didn't mention this thing. You didn't mention flipped classroom or, some other fancy buzzword technique. And there'll be an opportunity for you to suggest your ideas as well. So it wasn't intended to be exhaustive, but more just a way to capture, I suppose, the common techniques that I see used in vet. So what's in the list? There it is. We've got 23 things that we're covering today. Forgive me, we're just going to go through them in, I guess it's sort of a rapid fire session, and then it'll be up to you to dive into those that you're more interested in. I don't need to read those out. They're just there for your reference, but let's dive into the first one, which is, of course, the first one in the list there, discussions. So discussions are a really powerful technique for learning, for engaging, for getting, often new trainers are thinking about a whole day of training and they're going, wow, do I have to talk all day? Well, I hope not. And discussions are one of those strategies that gets your students talking instead of you. And your job is to facilitate that discussion and try and make it a useful experience that's connected to your learning objectives. And I'd say that'd be a recommendation for pretty much all of these strategies, is you think about what's the learning objective that I'm trying to achieve. And any of it, because sometimes these things can get out of hand. I certainly, especially in my early days, ended up with discussions that would just drag on for 45 minutes and they'd get off track because I sort of lacked that ability to kind of get it back on track and to bring it around to the learning objective that I was trying to achieve. So we've got to be careful with these. We've got to make sure that whatever we do, we try and keep it very much pinned to achieving that objective for our learners. So a discussion is basically where we might pitch an open question, ask the students to, there's many ways you can do it. So one way of doing it is to ask students to discuss with the person next to them. Okay, so two people, might be a group of three if you've got an odd number in the room, have them take notes and then have a spokesperson report back that summary to the group. So that might be what we call a think, pair, share approach. Or you can have a whole class discussion where it's a bit more of a free-for-all, or you can have small one-on-one group focused discussions. So you can see that under this broad heading of discussion, you can kind of use them in many different ways. We've got to make sure that the question or the problem or the thing that we use as the seed or the root to the discussion is clear and concise and thought-provoking. We need to probably, if it's a more complex thing, give it to them in written form. So it might be on a slide deck or a handout. I don't know how many times I've kind of pitched a question or something for a discussion and not had it in writing. And then people always come back to you and say, well, what are we meant to be talking about again? What are we meant to be discussing? What are we doing? What's the point? So having that in written form can really help to reinforce that, especially for more complex questions. Set clear time limits so that you don't get off track, and you set that from the beginning, along with any other expectations, so that you don't have to jump in halfway through and you get something really good happening and say, right, we're stopping it, and people go, oh, we're just getting into it. So make sure you set those parameters from the outset. When you've got people talking amongst each other, circulate around the group to monitor how the discussions are going, to make sure they're on track, to clarify anything. And if you're having a whole group discussion, just that last point there, it's really great to summarize any key themes that are emerging using the whiteboard or a butcher's paper that provides an anchor point, because the discussions can get quite broad ranging. They can get a little bit left of field. And so sometimes you need to kind of take what someone has said and maybe put it into simpler words, or clarify with them. So that can be really useful as well. Discussions can be challenging when you've got shy learners who maybe are unwilling to speak up in the class, especially if you're kind of just going around the room and getting anyone to contribute. So I really find that point there at the top where I've said, have them take notes. So rather than saying, hey, everyone, what do you think about this? Then you're only going to get the extroverts responding. So if you've got a few shyer students or it's a new group, sometimes the new groups are hard to get them kind of moving. Get them, say, pitch the question. Say, I'll give you 1 minute to just jot down some notes or thoughts. And then you can ask for you can invite their response. And because they've got something in front of them, they can, they'll feel more confident in sharing. They're not feeling so on the spot. Our next technique is the humble case study. So this is where we look at realistic scenarios derived from authentic vocational context, authentic job situations. They can be pitched in text, audio, video. The idea is that you guide learners to analyze a problem, maybe to figure out some key issues there, consider different perspectives, propose solutions, solve problems. You can do case studies individually. So it might be sort of more of a written activity. It might be something they do in pairs or small groups. Or again, we can start to see these interrelationships happening. This might be used to facilitate a whole group discussion. So you might do a case study. You might have the students either individually or in small groups respond to the case study independently. And then you invite a discussion about that. So you can start to see these things linking. Must be highly relevant. So be really careful with the way you pitch your case studies to make sure that they are really linked to those learning objectives and linked to the job. I think case studies are really great to pitch scenarios or help students appreciate the what ifs. Sometimes in vocational training, especially for the classroom trainers, where everything's quite clinical and put together for the sake of learning. And sometimes we don't allow our students to get full exposure to some of the more complex problems or unexpected things that might happen on the job. So a case study is a great way to kind of pitch those things. And for things like those, do you remember in the dimensions, the 4 dimensions of competency, one of them is we need to be assessing and teaching them to manage contingencies. So a case study can be a really great way to get them thinking about how to solve unexpected problems. You can really have fun and be creative with case studies. Get clear on the objectives, not just for you, but remember the principles of adult learning. They always talk about how adults need to know why they're learning something. So if you kind of pitch this really bizarre left of field thing that might be kind of a bit fun, a bit goofy or whatever, students are going to start to wonder, well, how is this relevant? How is this useful? So make sure that you make it clear what the objective of this is. You may need to have some guiding questions in there so that any discussions about the case study are relevant. This is a classic. So it's a bit hard to categorize this one. I think we could pare it down and we could further create subcategories here, but I've just broadly put here instruction, presentation, lecture, those sorts of things. So that is an engaging, articulate, enthusiastic speech. So the focus is mostly on you explaining something, but you might use visual content as part of it. It could be referring to an object. It might be PowerPoints. It might be referring to something on a handout, but this is where you deliberately, you take on the mode of the classic instructor, teacher, lecturer, where you are demonstrating enthusiasm, excitement, you're explaining how something is done or the why or the theory behind it. It must be clear, specific, and relevant. These are where those classic presentation skills come in. So we're trying to do things like eliminate those utterances like ums and ers, get really clear and precise with the way we explain things, not waffling on, not storytelling. The time limit for these sorts of approaches is debated. So there's various research out there. I think a 10-minute, if in doubt, 10-minute segments of just pure presentation is a safe bet. Though there are, as you'll see in the research that I share with you later, there are some teachers who bring it up to 30 to 40 minutes sometimes as well. Now that's not, as I said in the bottom point there, the presentation doesn't have to be entirely passive. You're still welcome to invite questions, to invite interaction, and to indeed maybe even bring in some of these other techniques that we're talking about here as well. The second last point there, ensure students can apply what was addressed in the presentation in subsequent learning activities. So this is about, again, bringing it back to those learning objectives, but also making sure that what you're actually teaching them has a use later on, so that they can actually apply that knowledge to solve a problem or to do a task or use what you've just taught them in some way. Otherwise, it's just learning facts. Facts alone, I mean, sometimes it's nice if you're a bit of a trivia whiz down at the pub on a Tuesday night. That might be helpful to learn some new facts, but for vocational students, we need to learn this stuff so that we can apply it and use it on the job. So always think about how what you're teaching is going to be used. Building on this, we're looking now at worked examples, demonstrations, explicit teaching. So it might certainly include that element of presentation, of lecture, of clear instruction, but the emphasis here is on actually showing people how to do stuff. And if you want to learn more about this sort of thing, explicit teaching, you might have caught that interview I did with Dr. Zach Groschel at the end of last year. If you missed it, the recording's up on our website. And he's published a book, and I think it's sold out. It's just, I tried to get my hands on it and I couldn't, they just kept running out of stock. So it's very popular. His book is on this idea of very direct instruction, explicit teaching. His book's called Just Tell Them How to Do It. So he's advocating for that really clear explanation of how to do stuff, really clear demonstrations. So what is it? It's a clear step-by-step demonstration of a task, demonstrating how to solve a problem, or demonstrating applying a concept or something along those lines. We clearly and explicitly state the steps, the how, the why, and the what ifs. You know, if you don't do this step, this is what can happen. Learners observe the demonstration. They might ask questions along the way too. They break down complex tasks into smaller, manageable steps. That's you, the trainer. You use clear and concise language. So we try to avoid any fluff, any extraneous stuff that might make it more convoluted than it needs to be. We provide very detailed examples. We might even include scripts or instructions or diagrams for the students so that they can follow along to build confidence. And we typically follow something like this. As again, it's the same idea as just doing a lecture and then never doing anything with that information, never giving them the opportunity to apply it. We must follow these kind of demonstrations with some guided and independent practice strategies. So actually giving the learners the opportunity to then try it. There are some interesting models that I'll mention later as well, like DEDICT, D-E-D-I-C-T, and DEPE, which are often used in military and sporting applications, which provide a framework which can be quite helpful. Simulated work environments. So I'll mention also in this session role play and simulations, but this gets its own mention, the concept of using a simulated work environment. So this is beyond just kind of getting students to, you know, role play a difficult customer interaction in the classroom, or you know, sort of miniature setups. This is a really, you know, deliberate attempt to try and create something that looks like the work environment. A really good example is I'm very lucky that in our office here, we're just across the road here is the TAFE. They have a restaurant called the Osprey, and it's run by the TAFE students and the teachers as well. And every Monday, they one of the students from the commercial cookery group becomes the head chef, and they design the menu and they do everything. They do the whole thing, and all the other students work under their supervision. And you got to pay. You bring your card, you got to pay for it, and you sit down. There are communal tables, and we're the customers, and the food's absolutely delightful. But yeah, they get the experience of actually being in a real work environment, and paying customers can come from anywhere to eat the food. So that's what we're talking about there, real world setups, complex operational environments. And there's many examples of those. I love that you remembered the Nirvana reference of Seattle, Chris. That's good. That's some good recall. You must have learned something from that. Love it. Group work. So let's talk about group work. Activities where learners work together in pairs or small groups to achieve some kind of common goal. Might be just discussions, might be solving a problem, it might be developing a project. So you can see that underneath the heading of group work, it could be all sorts of things that they're actually doing. The emphasis for group work, though, is it's on shared responsibility. So the idea of team working as a team, kind of that interdependence, relying on each other. If you don't do your bit, then I can't do my bit. And there's also the social element as well, which is a really effective in learning, in creating good learning environments. In group work, the idea is that we create a task that genuinely requires some collaboration, so it can't be achieved on their own. So otherwise, you'll end up with students just going home and kind of doing it in their own time, and then they're all just kind of replicating each other. So something that actually requires them to work together. You'll need to help them establish clear goals, both for themselves individually and for the group as a whole. You'll need to foster this supportive and respectful group environment. If it's a brand new group and you're throwing them all together to try and achieve a task, you may need to use something like a non-daggy icebreaker to get them all working together and collaborating effectively. Very clear instructions and expectations are important. Otherwise, they'll either get lost because these things, you want them to probably put a fair bit of time into it. And if they spend too much time going off on the wrong track, that could be wasted time. Time is precious for you and for your learners. So you want this to really count. So very, very clear instructions and expectations are important. Check their progress, and you might need to facilitate. So check in regularly to sort of make sure they're on the right track, check in on their goals. Say, okay, remember, this is what we're trying to achieve. This is the goal that we agreed that we'd be getting out of the group. And you might need to kind of facilitate a little bit, clarify those sorts of things. Have some accountability in there. So it might be accountability to each other. So reminding them that Fred is relying on Susie completing this thing, and if Susie doesn't get it done, then the whole thing will fall apart. And also, I think it's really great that you can allow them to show a bit of ownership and a bit of pride in what they've done. So if there's some kind of opportunity for them to present what they've done to the class, then that's really great. It might be an actual presentation, or if it's an online thing, they can share it on their screen, do a video. It might be might even remember going back to school, when the students would, create a science fair kind of thing, and the parents can go along and they can inspect what they've created. Some kind of way of showcasing what they've done. This is a really interesting one. And there's a lot of research on testing. One good source, I've mentioned this book a few times, there's a book called Make It Stick, The Science of Effective Learning. I think it's called, I know the main title is Make It Stick. It's by Peter Brown and other authors. But it's a really great book that is evidence-based, science-based strategies for learning. And one of the things they talk about is the effectiveness of testing as a learning strategy, not just, it's good, it's good for assessment. And we know that assessments, competency-based assessment is very important, but testing is a proven effective learning strategy. And a lot of people, a lot of students kind of, moan and groan at the idea of testing, because they feel like I'm being tested, I'm being judged, and I'm not ready yet. So when you do testing as a learning strategy, it needs to be very carefully introduced, and really clearly, you need to clearly tell them that this is not going to count to your final mark or anything like that. That it's low stakes. Really remind them that there's no terrible consequence to low performance here, other than allowing you to observe where further training is needed, or for them to find out for themselves where further learning is needed as well. So frequent low stakes testing, and the idea behind it is to do what's called retrieval practice. So that first bullet point there is just emphasizing that retrieving information from memory is far more effective for learning than just passive reading of learning material. So because that's what we do in real life when we go and we've got a job and we're performing a task or achieving a goal or solving a problem, is we have to go and retrieve that knowledge from long-term memory and then apply that to solve the problem or to do the thing. And so in a way, when we use testing as a learning strategy, this is getting students to do that very, very early on, to try and bring up what's been learnt from memory. So it's a really great tool for revising what's been learnt or practiced during class. I know I've mentioned this a few times, but Duolingo, the language learning app, and probably others, is almost, you'll notice in that there's no lessons. What they call lessons are pretty much entirely a test, where you might say some words in a different language or fill in the gaps. So their entire teaching method is through testing, and I can tell you they're a multi-million-dollar company, and they employ many learning designers and scientists who are looking at what's effective. They talk about, with testing, desirable difficulty. So it's that thing that, again, students kind of groan a little bit, but effortful learning that feels a bit hard builds more robust learning, more robust and accessible knowledge. It also is a really great tool to calibrate against illusions of mastery. So they found in a lot of the research that students that read their textbook and read their learning guides and everything else, they develop an illusion of understanding. But it's not until they actually try and retrieve that knowledge from long-term memory to solve a problem that they suddenly realize that maybe they don't know or understand as much as they ought. Feedback is very, very important. So letting them know where they've done well and maybe where improvement is needed. And it's also really great for you as a trainer to monitor progress as well. How can you do that? Quizzes, flashcards, having students summarize key concepts in a short passage, discussions, answering questions just verbally. It might be even doing a little presentation to the class, might be teaching their peers, demonstrating something. It doesn't matter what it is, as long as the thing that you get them to do is actually getting them to recall information rather than just passively read it. Okay, so role plays and simulations. Deborah, I'm sorry I'm not monitoring the chat so much at the moment. It's just me, so yeah, I'm just checking up here. Deborah, you've said to allow for flexibility when testing. I agree with that. That's a really good point. I love that you're all chatting amongst each other here and sharing your ideas as well. That's really amazing. I'm sorry I can't be sort of more present for the chat, but I'm really mindful of what I've got to get through today. Role play and simulations. So I talked before about, creating a simulated work environment where you want to create an authentic setting as much as possible. This is more about those kind of mini, creating like a mini environment, work environment. That as best as possible with the resources at hand, you try and replicate real world situations or real world problems, and get learners to take on a specific role. Sometimes they work together, like, creating a scene or a scenario, and they've got to role play it. You see that kind of stuff a lot in community services, dealing with difficult clients. Customer service ones, they do a lot of that kind of role play. You know, anything that might require a bit of that verbal back and forth between a customer and a client and a worker or something like that is really good. But of course, you know, we can think about simulations in terms of flight simulations, you know, getting into an actual bit of technology that simulates a real world setting, or it might be models. So I know I was talking to a friend who was doing some work in the mining and resources sector, and they had a setup. It was like almost looked like a kid's toy setup, but it was, you know, models of the trucks and the, you know, different bits of machinery and a model of the mine site layout. And, you know, they had to demonstrate, you know, where the truck would come up here. And if the truck's here, they've got to wait for this machine to do this thing, and they've got to sort of play out the thing. So obviously that alone is not going to give them the skills they need to go and operate the machinery, but it is a really effective and engaging way to get them doing or applying the knowledge. So these kind of games and things are really effective, more so than just telling them and just showing them on the screen. I think any role play needs really clear instructions, and unless it's something really simple, I think in most circumstances you'll want to back up those instructions with some you know, diagrams, a handout, something on the slide, so that they can refer back to what they're doing if they need to. You might even need to do a demonstration. So it could be you and someone else. You might get one of the learners from the group and kind of demonstrate the role play in front of the group, and then get them to go and practice it so they really can see what you're aiming for. Check for understanding beforehand, because you want to make sure that they're actually able to use and apply the knowledge effectively. If you throw them into a role play in a simulation and they're not ready, it can really get quite messy or amusing, depending on how you look at it. Using questioning, discussions, activities, anything to engage them after the role play to help them consolidate. So you might do a bit of a debriefing, a bit of a reflection, what worked well, what didn't, what did you struggle with? Hey, when you saw the others doing it, what did you think about their performance? You know, anything like that that gets them to kind of bring that back to memory. You've got to create a safe and supportive environment. That's so important for this sort of thing. They've got to feel like it's okay to play that role, to get into character. And we're not all born actors. So I think that's, you know, saying that it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to be a bit goofy and silly, or whatever's appropriate for what you're doing. If learners are hesitant to get involved, you know, maybe a bit of a script, giving them a smaller part to begin with, or a bit of extra preparation time can be helpful as well. For learners that are a bit more advanced, or you know, moving through the course to a more advanced stage, it's these sorts of things, role plays and simulations, are a really great way to introduce these unexpected elements. So, you know, we can role play something that's predictable and scripted, but then all of a sudden something might happen that they have to then respond to. And that's, again, we've got those dimensions of competency, checking how they respond to those difficult situations, contingency management skills. Structured questioning in its own right is a really effective learning strategy. So this might be carefully crafted questions to stimulate thinking, guide inquiry, check understanding, encouraging learners to connect new information with what they already know. It just goes, the idea of structured questioning is that it goes beyond just simple recall questions. What are the 4 principles of assessment? That's a very specific kind of question with a very specific answer. You might probe, clarify, get them kind of take it up a notch than just recalling facts. Plan your questions in advance so that you've got a bit of a plan for what you want to achieve out of them. Sometimes it can provoke some longer discussions and deeper engagement. So having a plan I think is really good if you're going to use structured questioning. Sometimes it can be really helpful in unlearning things. So sometimes learners might come in with pre-existing knowledge that's just not correct. So these sorts of questioning activities can help to dispel those misconceptions. Allowing time to consider their answers, formulate a response is good. So having them jot down some notes, responding to answers in a way that encourages further discussion and reflection. rather than just going, yep, that's correct. So we want to talk about, why was that a good answer? Why was that response maybe not quite on the right track? Questions are really good to facilitate peer-to-peer interaction, students working together as well. The questioning can also be written. It doesn't have to be a verbal Q&A in front of the whole class. So you can think about how you might use these in different ways. Peer feedback, peer learning. So this is where you get people working together and providing feedback on each other's performance or something they've done. It might be a project they've done, might be their performance in a role play, it might be a presentation they've done, it might be an answer to an activity online. You know, it doesn't have to be in the classroom again. It can happen after individual tasks, presentations, skill demonstrations, a project they've made. It should involve both giving and receiving feedback. So you need to teach learners how to actually take on feedback effectively and not be defensive about it. It can be really helpful to provide some criteria or rubrics or some kind of structure to the feedback, so it's not just free for all. So that so that both the learner who's performed the task and the learner who's giving the feedback has a clear objective or a clear specific set of criteria that they're providing feedback on. So they can objectively say, well, I saw you do this thing, but the criteria expects this. So we can see there's a bit of a gap there. Guided practice and scaffolding. So this is a really great follow-on from some of the earlier strategies I talked about, like lecturing or direct instruction or demonstrations, where it's mostly very teacher-centered, very teacher-led. But for the first time now, you're now getting students to apply what you've taught them. It might be doing a task, doing an activity, performing a skill, solving a problem. But the idea is that at this stage, you're very much at the very beginning, you're supporting them and guiding them. You might have heard that concept of I do, that's the demonstration. We do, that's what we're talking about here. And then you do. So once I've confirmed that you're doing well and I can leave you alone, your independent practice is now so much more effective and fruitful. So after demonstration, you work through examples or tasks step by step, then you check for understanding and you provide feedback, and then you let them do it. And then you watch them do it and you provide support and guidance, correction. You might even, depending on the nature of what you're teaching and the risks involved, you may allow stronger students to support weaker students. With the idea of scaffolding is that you gradually reduce it. You just like scaffolding on a building, once the building is nearing completion, you start to pull the scaffolding off. And the support is not there anymore because the learners can stand on their own 2 feet. But you've got to be strategic about when you do that. You can't just take it away and go, right, you've had 10 minutes to practice, you should be an expert now. You've got to watch and you've got to provide feedback and you've got to give them the confidence and say, you know, I reckon I could leave you with that now and you could do it on your own. Just that last point there, I'll draw your attention to. It's kind of an odd one. It comes from Rosenshine's Principles of Instruction, which you can Google and look up. And Barack Rosenshine talks about aiming for a high success rate. And I know at first glance you think, oh, of course, I want all my students to be highly successful. I want to aim for a high success rate. What he's really saying there is we want to make sure that during this crucial phase, where we're present with the students and we're watching their performance and we've got the opportunity to give them active feedback and guidance and support, is we want to aim to make sure that they're ready to go and do it by themselves, that they're capable to do it. Because if you throw them into independent practice where you may not be as present or not present at all, and they're still floundering or they're doing bad habits that makes it really, really difficult for them, that independent practice becomes very, very frustrating. And it only reinforces poor performance and poor practice. So it's very, very important that we check and confirm that they can do it independently without our support before we remove that scaffolding completely and allow them independent practice. This is a kind of teaching. I was a bit left of field here. I suppose it falls under scaffolding. This is at TAFE in Queen. I forget the campus we went to. We did a bunch of tours of different vocational learning facilities. But I really love this because you can see here, it's a frame for a house, but it's inside the TAFE. It's inside the facilities, and you can see that it's color coded. And I love this kind of thing. It's a really good learning aid because it's actually a form of scaffolding, not just using a construction metaphor there, but the coloured bits of timber are a really important part of the learning because, you know, a house frame that's actually being built in reality might look very much like that, but without the colours. But the colours, they can say, hey, see the green things, what does that do? You know, and they can explain what the green bits do and what the yellow bits do and what the blue bits do, the top plates, and why they're important. And so that's just one example of many where, you know, we have little things that are in place to support their practice, to support their recall, their memory, to support the instruction phase, so that eventually when they go out there, of course, you know, the houses they build on the street will not have color codes there that they can refer to. So there's many ways that scaffold, it's not just us hovering over the whole time. There are many ways that we can provide supports and scaffolding to enhance the learning process, to give them guidance before we pull that away. This is a real outlier. I struggled to I wasn't even sure whether I put it in, but it kind of sits in its own thing. But it's actually a really good little strategy. It's called the Ask It basket, and it's like a ballot box or a box basket hat, something like that, with some slips of paper. And you encourage students to ask questions in writing anonymously in the basket. It's really good for, you could probably do an online version of this too, but it's really good for groups and classroom learning where you're with them for a considerable amount of time. And you read out the questions and you answer it in front of the group at strategic points. So it might be the end of the lesson, or the end of the day, or wherever you think is necessary. And to get people doing it, you might be a little sneaky and preload it with a few relevant questions to encourage its use. Otherwise, if people think no one's using it, they might be too shy to do it, even though you might remind them that it's anonymous. It's just a really great little technique to get maybe the shyer students to make sure no one gets left behind. So I think this is a great tool. I think you can immediately see its use. And you might have other ways of achieving the same result too. Again, now moving from a really highly specific technique, I'm going to go broad here. I said it was a little bit chaotic, the structure of this necessarily. Coaching. So I wanted to get you thinking about different modes of teaching. So we've talked about, you know, the lecturer and the instructor a lot so far, and the support person, but coaching as an overarching strategy is really helpful. Typically when you're playing the role of the coach, you're observing, you might be listening, questioning the performance of a skill or a task, or them doing something, and you're providing guidance and advice. And the aim is, the goal is to help them achieve an objective. A bit like a footy coach. What does the footy coach want from their team? They want the team to win. That's their very clear objective. And so they do anything they can to get the best out of their team. Now, I mean, you probably have seen a few footy coaches and swimming coaches. You know, they're not necessarily the highly finely tuned athlete, but they might have been at some point in the past. But they're very effective at asking the right questions or prescribing the right things for them to do. So taking on a coaching role can be very effective in VET, especially in longer courses, and is very much focused on performance, and is often a shorter term relationship, as opposed to something like mentoring, where you have an expert, someone who is really good at it, has had a lot of success, and they provide hyper-specific, very tailored, very relevant advice, support, and guidance that's tailored to an individual. So coaching might be individual or a team, but mentoring is really typically focused on an individual. It's focused on their growth, their performance, their excellence, their achievement of goals. And it might even involve you establishing connections between the mentee, the person being mentored, and other experts. These relationships are often longer term than coaching. We've kind of talked about this in other ways, but we've got here independent activities, projects, tasks, independent practice, those sorts of things. So it's basically where you get students to work alone, to do a task, to answer questions, to do an assignment, to do an activity, you know, what we might commonly call homework, which I'm sure gets all your learners very, very excited. Just like we mentioned before, we want to make sure that students you know, they've had good quality instruction that leads up to the homework. And getting them to do something that they're really floundering and struggling with is very problematic. So good scaffolding and guided practice, good feedback that then leads up to them feeling confident and comfortable doing that work by themselves. Just back to the adult learning principles, we want to make sure that we talk to the learners about why we're doing it. So, you know, don't just prescribe homework for the sake of it. Think about, well, what's this going to actually achieve? Does it help you consolidate the learning? Does it help you perform better? Does it lead into something we're going to do tomorrow? What's the benefit of doing this homework? So they understand the reason why. Project-based learning. This has got its own little category as distinct from others. So, you know, we've talked about little projects, but this is where the main thrust of the learning is about actually doing a project. So it's more than just doing the little activity at the end of the unit. It becomes the main vehicle for learning knowledge and skills throughout a course. It's authentic, engaging, complex projects over an extended period. They typically create a product. They might solve a customer problem. It might be independent, but it usually requires collaboration. I remember doing one of these at university years ago, and I found it a really effective learning experience. It was in software development. We had to, you know, we were given a real client with a real world problem, and we had to solve it using software. And it should mirror the real world and allow lots of opportunities throughout for learning. But, you know, these things can easily get out of hand if they're not monitored. So you've got to have lots of good feedback, lots of support, frequent measurement against outcomes, regular check-ins with them, lots of meetings with your students on how things are going, just so it stays on track and doesn't get out of hand. A quick mention of work placement and work experience. That's where you get students, you place them into a real job to gain real world experience, like an apprenticeship, traineeship, internship, just a week of work experience. The tips on this one is it can be really, I mean, it's obviously a very authentic way to learn because they're getting real life experience and a real job, but there's some cautions like, you know, are they going to be supported on the job? Are they going to be given access to opportunities to learn? You know, we need to make sure they're not getting bullied. You know, we need to watch out for their well-being. We need to monitor, you know, how their relationships on the job are going. Is it actually being effective? Are they getting exposure to the right tasks and activities? So that's a whole conversation for another day, but it is still a really great, and when it's done properly, a really excellent, authentic learning experience. And in fact, this is you know, apprenticeships and guilds and all those things is the very early basis of our vet system that we have today. So a lot of it stems from this. Videos are great. I think video needs its own little mention. So it's showing relevant videos. So don't just show them cartoons and things just because you think it'll be fun. It'll, you know, it'll use up some time that you don't have to teach and you can sit back and relax. And it's worthwhile thinking about how you can combine videos with other strategies like questioning or activities so it's effective. But videos are great. I mean, it's kind of underrated. We often forget that we have this amazing library of videos out there on YouTube and everything else that can be quite helpful in doing things like showing situations that you might not be able to replicate in class, demonstrating, you know, often in workplace health and safety, you know, it's pretty predictable. They're going to show a bunch of videos of, you know, catastrophes in the workplace. Now, you can't really show that any other way, but videos are really great for that kind of thing. You know, what can happen if you don't wear your PPE? It can broaden the range of examples of good and bad practice. So that often students only see you as the trainer, so you can expose them to other people, other experts. It's visually engaging. So sometimes there's some really great videos out there that just explain things really well with nice animations and drawings and things that you probably maybe can't do as well on a whiteboard or something. Videos are great for pausing. You can slow down time, you can zoom in, you can see specific details and slow things down in different ways that you might not be able to do as a live experience. Now, of course, I won't say it in any other way, but just be mindful of copyright. There's a session that we've done with the Copyright Council on this very topic. So you can go back and review that recording if you're curious about the copyright implications of using videos. Feedback. This is giving feedback on tasks, responses to questions, any kind of performance in the class. A good guideline is that the depth and the quality of your feedback should match the complexity of the task. So if it's a really short task, short and sharp, simple feedback is great. If they've poured their heart and soul into something over several days or put many, many hours into it, a quick thumbs up and great work is not going to cut it. You really need to go into a bit more depth as a genuine kind of reward for what they've done. Aim to improve poor performance. It's not just about giving them good news, but highlight things they need to do better, because that's the whole point of it, is to correct and elicit better performance. Good feedback builds confidence, builds motivation, encourages participation, and good feedback is particularly useful when you're reducing support. So we talked a lot about scaffolding in this session, when it's time to take away those supports and encourage them to say, hey, you've got a lot of evidence now of you performing really well on your own. I think we can actually take away these supports and you can go and work independently. Student-led instruction, that might be getting them to do activities where they do presentations to the class. The catch here is just be mindful of students who you want to have some mechanism to kind of check what they're going to do beforehand, so that you can check their accuracy and correct any inaccuracies. If they do a presentation that's sort of really off track, you need to be able to step in and be prepared to go, hey, what you've said there is not quite right. Reflection is really powerful. I think it needs to be more than just go away and think about it. I mean, that in itself is a form of reflection, but it's better if it's more deliberate than that. So journaling, questions, activities, posting to discussion boards, discussions amongst their peers, self-assessment, those sorts of things can be really great, a great way to get more out of reflection. All right, we're near the end here. Technology, online, asynchronous learning. So this is where you get people to use technology in some way. Now, this is a huge, broad, overarching category that could probably have 10 one-hour sessions and we still wouldn't be scratching the surface. But this is about you considering, how can I use technology in a useful way in the classroom, in the training room? It might be as simple as using quizzes, activities, hotspots, labeling, any kind of interactive things, games, interactive videos, webinars, podcasts. Virtual reality, augmented reality is really good. So in this picture here, you can see this is an augmented reality welding thing. So the teacher and the students get to practice welding, and it feels like a real welder, but it's got all this stuff on the screen where you can it'll give you immediate feedback on how clear your weld is, how accurate it is. And the benefit, while it's an expensive and complex setup, the benefit is they're not wasting metal, they're not wasting tools and material and all these other things. So it can be really beneficial and worth the investment if done thoughtfully. And of course, querying AI language models like ChatGPT can be a really great way of just students asking, the silly questions. They feel comfortable asking the silly questions in AI, so that can be useful as well. Games like Kahoots are really good. I think you get the idea here as well. That word gamification was a bit of a buzzword for a while there. But it's still, even old school games are good as well, like physical games or incentive or pop quizzes or flashcards. They don't necessarily require technology, but they get students interacting. Now, I'm mindful of the time. This was always going to happen when I had 23 or 4 odd detailed strategies for you. I did say it was a bit of a rapid fire thing, but I've got there on the screen a QR code to a Padlet. So if you want to do it, maybe we'll just do this after the session. If you have time, I'd love to hear from you what strategies you're using. And I know in the chat that you've been explaining some of the techniques that you're using really well. So I will review those. And I'm just curious to see what others are doing and what they've found relevant. I'm just going to provide a link to that too, in case someone is missing, is unable to do that, the QR code. And if you're curious, I'm just going to give a quick shout out to this bit of research here. So just in very fresh off the press, reasonably fresh anyway, March 2025, Tabitha Griffin and Nikki Davidson have released a research summary, which is aimed to identify effective vet teaching practices and activities that teachers who have been recognised for excellence are using. So it's got lots of quotes and examples. So if you want to kind of see what you're doing and compare it with what other TAFE not just TAFE, vet trainers are doing around Australia, this is a really great research summary on it. I find it's a really good thing. So definitely check that out. I will also put that in the chat. Just give me one moment. I'm just going to plug everything in there for you. And I've got a link to our next session too, because I wanted to string all this together and give you some strategies on how you can actually plan this stuff. So, you know, these things in isolation are not particularly helpful until you start to logically sequence them in a way that's going to achieve an outcome. So we need to think about things like adult learning, cognitive load, what the science tells us about how people learn to actually intelligently string these things together. So that'll be covered in the next session. I've put a link to that in the chat. I'll pop it back there once again. There's a QR code if you want to use that to sign up to the next webinar, which is next month. Thank you so much for coming along. I really appreciate it. As I said, to those who stuck around for at least 80% of the session, you'll get a certificate very soon, and we'll release the slides and the recording and any other resources in our newsletter this week. Thank you so much. Have a great day.